The Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce runs a public lecture programme exploring contemporary issues. Teachers TV has access to these lectures, and today we bring you a talk by Tim Gill on the subject Risk and Childhood. Tim is a leading expert on childhood play and risk, and author of the book No Fear, Growing Up in a Risk-Averse Society. After Tim's talk, experts from Barnardo's, ROSPA and Save the Children will respond. The lecture is chaired by writer and broadcaster Dee Burkett.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted that the RSA has taken on board the issue of childhood and risk, a very, very important issue, very dear to my heart, both professionally and personally, as a mother of 3 young children. I'm sure it's also something very close to most of your hearts. The perception and prescribed boundaries of risk is something that I believe affects most of us, most days of our lives. Most recently, of course, with this, the very heavy snow we had here, which seemed to paralyze the whole country. And that next morning, when the blanket was over the world, I took my 2 younger children to their primary school. And when we arrived there, the playground had been cordoned off. The head explained that it wasn't safe for the children to play in the snow-covered playground. Now, my youngest 5-year-old looked at this huge expanse of untrodden snow. Can you imagine it? Not a footprint on it. This massive blanket stretching out in front of him. And he looked at me longingly and he said, "Mum, it's torture." Are we protecting or are we torturing our children? This is amongst the issues that we're going to be tackling tonight. And I'm extremely glad to be able to welcome Tim Gill, one of the foremost thinkers, or in Tim's language, rethinkers on childhood in Britain. Until recently, director of the Children's Play Council and author of the forthcoming book, No Fear, Growing Up in a Risk-Averse Society. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Tim Gill.
Thank you very much, Dee, and can I say what a pleasure it is to be here, and thanks to the RSA for inviting me. Actually, I'd like to start by asking you a question, a bit cheeky for a speaker, I know, but the question is this: where was your favourite place to play as a child? I'd like you to think about this for a moment. Picture one place in your mind's eye, and then turn to your neighbour and just share with them your memory of that place. Very brief description. Where was that place? What was it like? Time is short, so I'm going to give you about 15 seconds each. So off you go. Okay. I said I'd be brutal. I want some very quick feedback, please. I would like you, please, to stand up if the place that you described was out of doors. Okay. 95%, I would say. Thank you very much. Sit down again, please. And now, this is the last time for those of you who are not wild about standing up. Please stand up this time if the place that you described was out of sight of adults. Probably about the same proportion. Thank you very much. Now, I do that exercise all the time, and your answers mirror those of almost every group of grown-ups that I've worked with one exception, which I'll come back to right at the end of my talk. And now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking the world is a very different place now, and that the days when parents felt able to let their children roam free are long gone. Now just hold that thought, if you would, and instead ask yourself another question. Why is that memory so universal? Why do these experiences of being out under the open skies and away from the adult gaze, why do they feel so resonant to us? Now, I think the answer is quite simple. It's that from the earliest age, we, human beings, hunger for autonomy. We have an urge to get to grips with the world around us on our own terms, if you like, to get the hang of being a human being. Childhood is a journey, and at its start, children are tiny, powerless, and utterly dependent. But at its destination lies independent adulthood. The core of this journey is a gradual assumption of ever more control and responsibility. Now, John Adams, who's here tonight, put it so well the other day when I was speaking to him that I'm going to crib his words. He said that what we call development is a progressive handing over of risk management decisions to children. But we do not understand this process at all well, so we have a big problem about risk and childhood. I'm going to say a bit more about what the problem is and its origins, and I'm going to do this by looking at 3 topic areas, or case studies of risk aversion, if you like. Playgrounds, child protection, and I guess the most topical one right now, children's bad behaviour. Now, in each case, I'll argue that we, by which I mean parents, teachers, politicians, the media, pretty much all of us, are pursuing a zero-risk approach to childhood. We are trying to minimise the likelihood of any adverse outcomes whatsoever, no matter how trivial or improbable. I will argue that this pursuit of the zero-risk childhood is at best wrong-headed and at worst potentially disastrous. That our growing anxiety about harm to children and harm by children is taking us 180 degrees away from the kind of childhoods that best nurtures children and that best serves the interests of the rest of us. I will argue from history that this approach to childhood is not the fault of the compensation culture, nor is it the fault of the nanny state, although neither of these 2 recent developments make things any easier. Instead, the reason why we find the goal of the zero-risk childhood so tempting is because of fundamental confusion about what childhood is for and about the adult role in it. And I'll conclude that what we need to do is to think of childhood in a better way. Crucially, we need to reintroduce something like the kind of everyday adventures that epitomise our own childhoods, experiences that are in danger of vanishing altogether for today's children. My first case study is that most emblematic of childhood territories, the playground. Over the past 30 years or so, playgrounds have become overrun by the pursuit of risk elimination. Wall-to-wall safety surfacing, tame equipment, dog-proof fencing, and a sterile, unchallenging ambience are fitted as standard. But perhaps you need more convincing that there's a problem. After all, children do have accidents on playgrounds, sometimes serious ones, and isn't it better to be safe than sorry? Actually, thanks to the work of Professor David Ball, we know quite a lot about accidents in playgrounds. I'll spare you the statistics, but they show that playing on playgrounds has for decades been less risky than playing cricket, rugby, football, or even non-contact games like badminton and tennis. Now, I will say something about the statistics on child playground fatalities. These events are incredibly rare. David Ball found that there was perhaps 1 equipment-related fatality every 3 or 4 years across the whole of the UK. Even so, some might say that it's all very well of me making light of that figure, but how would I feel if it were my child? Now, in truth, I don't know the answer to that question. Such a loss is surely all but impossible to contemplate. But what I do know is that as a way of trying to guide policy, the question is deeply unhelpful. If we were always required to look at the world through the eyes of the most unlucky, then we would always choose zero risk. Surely the right answer to the question, how would I feel, is this: that we would all want to feel that our money and our public space was being used wisely. And in fact, the amount of money being spent on safety surfacing gives perhaps the best proof that playgrounds have become infected by risk aversion. In the UK, on average, 40% of the capital cost of a new playground goes on high-tech rubber surfacing. Put it another way, if we cut down on this expense, we could get almost twice as many playgrounds for our money. Add up the sums, and we've spent perhaps £300 million of public funds in the last decade on saving, at the very most, 2 or 3 lives. Meanwhile, in many neighbourhoods, run-down playgrounds are being closed for lack of funds, while in others, they're so dull that some children seek their thrills in other, far more hazardous environments. Now, actually, there are good reasons for thinking that safety surfacing has no safety benefits whatsoever because of what the risk experts call risk compensation. This is when people behave in a more dangerous way because they feel safer. Risk compensation is extremely common, although it can be hard to measure. But the fact is that being cautious when we're off the ground is one of the most basic of human instincts. Just take a look at how the children play on this playground next time you pass through Trafalgar Square. Hard edges everywhere, granite for your landing spot, and yet hundreds of children play there every day, all day long, with no adverse consequences. Why? Because they take care. Why have playgrounds become so risk-averse? To answer this, I'm going to revive another decades-old memory, that of the TV programme That's Life. Now, around about 15, 20 years ago, this programme ran a campaign about playground safety. The campaign aimed to force playground providers to install safety surfacing. In one episode, the programme sets out to prove just how well safety surfacing works through the device of dropping china plates onto first the studio floor and second the rubber matting, with predictable consequences. Now, I cannot think of a better image to depict our confusion about childhood, the implication that children are irredeemably vulnerable and that our role as adults is to protect them at all costs, is laid bare for all to see. What is equally clear is that, in this case, the pursuit of the zero-risk childhood has nothing to do with either the compensation culture or the nanny state, for the simple reason that neither of those supposed beings were in existence at the time of the campaign. It's not too hard, I think, to argue that playgrounds have suffered from the disease of risk aversion. My next case study looks at a more difficult and emotive issue, child protection. The past few years have seen our fear of the unknown abuser grow exponentially in spite of clear evidence that the numbers of such people out there posing a serious threat to children is minuscule and, moreover, no greater than it was 10, 20 or 30 years ago. But our fear of the abuser is no longer just focused on unknown adults. The quixotic pursuit of the zero-risk childhood has so clouded our vision that with the passing of the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act 2006, we have placed 7.5 million adults, a quarter of the adult working population, under suspicion of being abusers. Since child abuse overwhelmingly takes place within the family home, this cannot be proportionate. Even some of those most closely associated with the new regime have their doubts. One-time Olympic sportswoman Celia Brackenridge is one of the architects of child protection in sport, and she claimed recently that, quote, "It's got out of hand in some areas. People say, we're not going to run our junior club," or "nobody will drive the bus." When I said at the start that risk aversion is taking us in totally the wrong direction, I meant it. Here's an example I heard about from a YMCA just a few days ago. It runs courses for older people on computing and the internet. Someone had the great idea of getting teenagers in to help as volunteers. Now, I don't need to explain, I think, why that's such a great idea. But it couldn't happen because someone else realised that all the silver surfers would have to be CRB checked, because of child protection procedures. The government's own report admits that it has not got the faintest idea how many cases of child abuse this new Act will prevent. In fact, I don't think this has got anything to do with protecting children. It has more to do with what Michael Power, in his book, The Risk Management of Everything, called secondary risk management, or what you and I would call covering our backs. His book forensically analyses this phenomenon and lays bare some of its side effects, including a complete flight from judgment and ever-growing confusion about what the rules really state. The CRB cost the country £83 million to run last year, and that was before these new laws. Childline, a service that actually protects children and that is founded on a faith in children's ability to decide for themselves when they need to ask for help, spends £14 million and has not got enough cash to meet the need. As with safety surfacing, the costs and benefits look way out of kilter. And credit where credit's due, Childline was originally conceived and piloted by That's Life. Now, the greatest danger in all this is not that we hurt the feelings of adults resentful that they are not to be trusted anymore. It is that we undermine the very ties that make communities safe and welcoming for children. For a foretaste, look no further than the tragic case of Abigail Ray, a child aged just 2 years old, who in 2002 drowned when she left her nursery unnoticed. Now, a passing motorist saw her out on the streets, yet did nothing because he was afraid he would be accused of abducting her. My third and final case study is children's bad behaviour. Given my plea for more childhood freedom, I suspect this is where your doubts are greatest. When we look at what's happening in parts of Peckham, surely what we see are the consequences of giving children too much freedom, so much that they're completely out of control. It is absolutely clear that some children are leading such chaotic lives in such hostile and desperate circumstances that no single measure is going to solve the problem. And some children clearly do have too much freedom and too few boundaries. And yet, if we visited a town in the West Midlands last summer, we would have seen quite a different picture. In Hales Owen, a girl was playing hopscotch on the pavement with her friends last July when they were accosted by police, community support officers and told to stop. In the same town, in the same month, says the Birmingham Mail, the police not only arrested but DNA tested 3 12-year-olds for the crime of building a treehouse. None of the children had ever been in trouble with the police before. The West Midlands Police were unapologetic, explaining that, quote, by targeting what may seem to be relatively low-level crime, we aim to prevent it developing into more serious matters. Now, these are, as yet, rare incidents, but they're signs, I'm sure you'll agree, of a disproportionate reaction to troublesome behaviour from children. And yet again, they're happening because we've gotten confused about what being a child is all about. Now, to show this, I want to do one last piece of audience participation. I'm going to read out a list of childhood games and activities, and I want you to listen carefully and ask yourself if you can remember doing any of these things as a child. And apologies in advance to any of you who finds any of these things politically incorrect. Cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, Brits and Germans, Superman or Superwoman, Batman and Robin, gang fights. Now this time, I'll keep it simple, I'll just ask for a show of hands, please, for anyone in the room who's participated in any of those events, activities. Thank you very much. I haven't done that one before, and you didn't disappoint. Now, large numbers of boys, and clearly girls, have for generations devoted much of their free time to all kinds of rough and tumble play, play fighting, and combative role play. In your day and mine, any nearby adults would have turned a blind eye. Today, such games are banned from most nurseries and many schools and tend to bring shame on any parents whose children are seen playing them. As the officers from Halesowen's police station so helpfully demonstrated, what we're witnessing is the spread of a zero-tolerance approach to children's behaviour, and it is as wrong-headed as all the other zero-tolerance approaches that we've seen so far. In fact, play fighting, gunplay, rough-and-tumble play are neither atavistic displays of animal aggression, nor are they mindless reenactments of last night's TV. These forms of play give children the chance to perfect all sorts of social skills in contexts where real harm is not part of the game. They help children to form and maintain friendships, to learn about their position and status in the peer group, and to develop their wider social skills. But we grown-ups don't quite know what's going on, and we don't want to get blamed if it really was a fight after all, so we stop it on sight. Play fighting has been transformed into a deeply disturbing facet of childhood, and the outcome of this misplaced attempt at protection is a classic set of side effects. Rather than protecting society from the next generation of thugs, widespread bans on play fighting may work in the other direction, depriving young boys of the chance to learn how to negotiate tricky situations as they grow up. Another side effect is that adults demonise the behaviour and label those boys who engage in it as unruly troublemakers, a prophecy that sadly all too many of them go on to fulfil. In each of my set of 3 case studies, we've seen how the pursuit of the zero-risk childhood has led us to close down childhood experience and undermine the development of children's autonomy, resilience, and sense of responsibility. Now, with more time, which Dee's not going to give me, I could have expanded my set of case studies of risk aversion to include the virtual world, school trips, outdoor education, anti-bullying work, disabled children. The list is long. What's more, this tendency appears to be peculiarly British, or at least Anglo-American. Other European countries, this is a playground in Freiburg in Germany, do not show the same extreme symptoms, and I believe this in part explains why the UK's children finished at the bottom of the UNICEF report published last week. Studies on children's travel patterns, some of them done by Mayor Hillman, who's here tonight, and his colleagues, show that we keep children indoors and isolated from their communities much more than some other countries. A recent Bernardo's report found that childcare in Denmark is marked by an acknowledgement of the need for children to take gradually more responsibility for their everyday lives. Perhaps children in the UK are so controlled and supervised for so long that when they eventually spread their wings, they have very little idea of how the real world works, and they either go wild or struggle to cope. There's certainly clear evidence from long-term child development studies that our children really are finding life more difficult than in previous decades. Now, last week, Shadow Education Secretary David Willits gave a talk on intergenerational relationships. He quite rightly pointed out that most children today want the same things in their lives as we did: a good job, an enjoyable social life, a close relationship, and perhaps one day a family of their own. What's changed, he said, is that the intermediate steps are becoming ever more difficult. I agree. Where we diverge is that he concluded that children need more structure to help them along the way. I draw a different conclusion, that what children need is not more structure, but more opportunities to nurture their own sense of responsibility and self-reliance from the earliest possible age. You might think the prospects for progress are slim, but I'm cautiously optimistic. In the playground industry, we realised a few years ago that a preoccupation with safety at all costs was creating big problems. So the Play Safety Forum, a group of the sector's safety experts, went back to first principles and had a long, hard look at what playgrounds are for in the first place. We drew up a statement arguing for a more balanced approach, and it embraced the goal of risk management rather than risk elimination. exactly the position spelt out by the Health and Safety Executive, one of the signatories of that last year. In the wake of the forum's document, some of the most recent playgrounds are becoming more exciting, challenging places to play. We've even seen the relaxation of European safety standards, a move, I'm told, almost unheard of in safety circles. Now, this modest success shows that we can turn back the tide of risk aversion and reaffirm the value of opening up children's lives, expanding their horizons and allowing them to take more responsibility for their own safety. The RSA's Risk Commission, which with great foresight identified childhood as one of its key themes, and the Children's Society, which with equal foresight launched its Good Childhood inquiry last year, present promising new opportunities to widen the debates. And I'm pleased to say that of the 30 or so people who've completed my online survey on the RSA website, 80% feel that grown-ups are interfering too much in childhood. Now, I don't want to end on a downbeat note, but there is a big but. I mentioned during my warm-up that not everyone gave the same answers to my childhood memory questions as this audience. The odd ones out are the people under the age of about 25. While they are equally positive about being out of doors, a significant proportion of this age group do not say that their favourite place to play was out of sight of adults. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this profoundly disturbing. It raises the prospect of a generation of people coming into maturity whose childhoods have been spent under the constant and increasingly anxious gaze of adults. And this is why I am quite genuine when I leave you with this final thought, that perhaps in rethinking our attitudes to childhood, the most important approach we grown-ups have to revive is not caring, it's not discipline, it's benign neglect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Could we welcome now the first respondent, who is Chris Hanby from Bernardo.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Last December, I broke into my son's school. Not a confession I make lightly to such an august gathering, and with a relatively new boss who previously ran the prison service. Or rather, I broke with my son into his school grounds. For the last few months, he had described a den he'd built in an area of wooded ground that butted onto the school playing fields. He described in great detail to all of the family how the tree walls were supported by a wooden entrance, and that inside there was a kitchen, a sleeping area, and that flowers had been planted outside the entrance, an uncharacteristic touch for a 10-year-old boy. And he'd established an elaborate system of traps installed to catch teachers and the unwary. But the den had been discovered by the dinner ladies, and driven by the twin goblins, Elf and Safety, he'd been banished forever from revisiting the site. Our breaking and entering was to remove the vital contents of his den, and importantly for him, bring them home. When I arrived, I expected to see some complicated, dangerous book for boys structure, with commanding views of the school and playing fields. Not a bit of it. It took a while to see the strange collection of carefully arranged stones, the strategically positioned twigs, and the somewhat struggling sunflower plants. What existed in his imagination had quite literally to be believed, to be seen. In terms of a recognizable building, the den simply didn't exist. But we brought home the assortment of sticks, really only suitable for the fire, and gave them the due reverence that he felt they deserved. He also carefully dug up the sunflowers, and we took those as well. My son doesn't share the Secretary of State's vision of education. He regards learning as slightly overrated and would doubtless have agreed with Mark Twain that it takes just as long to remain ignorant as it does to become knowledgeable, so why bother? But the den represented an oasis for him, if that's not a mixed metaphor, a place where he could escape from double maths and let his imagination flourish. Indeed, it was probably the thing that kept him going during double maths, and in the other tedious demands that Wordsworth described as shades of the prison house, crowding in on a young childhood. Now, no doubt there were good reasons for the dinner lady's actions, and everyone here could no doubt rehearse these. It was unsafe. Sticks can be poked into eyes, people fall from trees, and it was difficult to properly supervise. But it was another example of life being confined by a determination to eliminate risk from the daily experience of children and young people, and in so doing, stifle creativity. Barnardo's works with about 120,000 young people in the UK, so risk is a daily challenge. In line with many other charities now, the search on an annual basis for an insurer who will take the risk of insuring our business becomes more of a challenge. And we struggle, as do others, with a world which increasingly fails to distinguish risk from hazard, or to acknowledge that people learn to assess and manage risk by encountering it. Furthermore, I suspect that the so-called risks, often driven by an increasingly litigious society, or at least the fear of litigation, at least, may often see a disconnect between activities that are banned and activities that lead children and young people to the crowded waiting rooms of A&E departments. This latter point is worth dwelling on. The recently published Joint Audit Commission and Healthcare Commission report, Better Safe Than Sorry, argues that each year there are about 2 million attendances by children at hospital accident and emergency departments through accidents. Two conclusions from this report are most stark. In the 1 to 14 age group, a lot of these are caused by burns, falling downstairs at home, slipping on railway embankments, and poisoning. Hardly the major areas concentrated on by health and safety risk elimination, and certainly by public bodies. Secondly, that children of parents who have never worked or who have been unemployed for a long time are 13 times more likely to die from unintended injury than children of parents in higher managerial and professional occupations. Now, I think that this has two effects. The first is confining the lives of children and young people in the way that I have already described, and Tim Gill also outlined so eloquently. The second is the direct effect on children and young people because of the actions of adults. And I hope that finally you will permit another personal example. About 20 years ago, I ran a regional children's assessment centre that dealt with some of the most challenging young people we as a society create. One young girl who had seen both of her parents commit suicide quite brutally with knives in front of her. The nightmares and reliving she experienced was more real to her than anything that had happened during the day. An extra mattress had been put against her bed and the wall to stop her hurting herself in sleep, and the staff sleep-in room was positioned next door to her bedroom. The pattern was a familiar one. Her nightmares would begin, the sleeping-in staff member would go through, comfort her, sometimes make her a hot drink, and settle her, returning to bed only to find that the whole process began again in about an hour. I was part of that sleep-in rota and looked back with a kind of horror at the questions that would now be asked. How were you dressed when you went into her bedroom? Who was with you? Where did you position yourself? Who can support your statements? Why was there no female staff member with you? And of course, children and young people not only deserve total protection, but have been the subject of awful abuse in residential and foster care, for example. But the kinds of regimes we now operate in most residential establishments in particular is a cautious refusal to enter into any of the normal human contact that a parent or carer extends to his or her child. Is this what we mean by every child matters? In summary, I make no apology for giving you two pretty personal examples. Generalizations are always tricky, but behind RSA's commitment to looking at the issue of risk are real children living real lives. The vain attempt to eliminate risk, driven by reputation or litigation, confines the lives of children and restricts those who care for them. It is also at odds with the statistics on a lot of accidents and denies the correlation between accidents and social class. If you finally accept Liv Ullmann's view that children are the point of all movement, then with movement comes risk, and with risk, growth into responsible adulthood. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can we now hear from second respondent, Tom Malarkey, from the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents.
Prevention rather than pretension. I think that's much better. Thanks very much, Dee. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Firstly, I would like to compliment Tim on his well-considered and thought-provoking arguments. The newspapers are full of tales of the nanny state, and so it is good to see a coherent and rather less judgmental approach being taken by an expert who has considered more than one side of the argument. That said, of course, you wouldn't expect the Chief Executive of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents to agree with Tim. Instead, you would expect others to be saying that most accidents are preventable, that all accidents are lamentable, and that no accident is acceptable. If you wanted to find an advocate of zero tolerance in the field of child accident prevention, you would surely seek to look no further than what you might suspect is one of Britain's chief nannies, in order to hear a contrary view to Tim's. After all, accidents are still the principal cause of death and serious injury for everyone below the age of 30 in this country. Well, I'm really sorry to disappoint you. Those of you who are hoping for a little dust-up this evening are going to be disappointed. Although we wouldn't lay claim to the idea of risk balance within ROSPA, we are and have been one of its strongest advocates, particularly in recent years, when we have started to challenge national perceptions of childhood risk, rather like Tim has tonight. Let me give you a couple of examples. Within ROSPA, we operate a playground safety consultancy service, which is well recognised as being one of the best sources of advice in the country. In recent years, we have drawn further away from the purported goal of absolute safety. Of course, a few decades ago, some playgrounds were incredibly dangerous and many children suffered serious injury. But we believe, as Tim has suggested, that there are also dangers in going too far the other way. If the landing is too soft or the risk too minute to pose any kind of challenge to the child, he or she will leave that playground with an opportunity to learn lost. Better a scraped knee or a twisted ankle now, we argue, than a more serious injury later, caused by a lack of understanding of the business of taking a risk and suffering the consequences. Perhaps the most practical work we do on making this happen is through the national coordination of LASER, Learning About Safety by Experiencing Risk. What an awful acronym. ROSPA brings together over 80 projects nationwide in which children can learn about fire safety, road safety, drowning, and wider risks, such as mugging, all in an environment which seeks to replicate the situations they might one day find themselves in. The popularity and value of these projects is tremendous, and we have no doubt that they are a means of educating and informing without taking away from children their natural curiosity and need to experiment. In such a controlled, exciting and stimulating environment, we believe children can be exposed to risk both to help them to avoid taking it unnecessarily and to know what to do about it if the worst happens. But I couldn't leave you this evening with any sense that we are doing all that we can as a nation. It's just not true. There is still no national focus on accident prevention, no minister or department taking responsibility. There is no new and refreshed data on which we can base debates like this one tonight. ROSPA is running the old databases, which have diminishing value, and the government will not fund their renewal. And there is a massive focus on the treatment of accidents, including amongst children, without any real commitment to prevent them happening. A serious burn for a child will cost, on average, £250,000 to treat. The fractional cost of preventing it by better education and awareness is just not on the government's radar screen. So congratulations, Tim, for bringing this debate forward and for making us all think. We agree with your perceptions in the main. Our mantra, as I read yours tonight, is to try to make children's lives as safe as necessary, not as safe as possible. Thank you.
Now, our last respondent is Nikhil Roy from Save the Children. Nikhil.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by thanking the organizers for extending this invitation to my organization, Save the Children, and to myself. I'd also like to congratulate Tim on a very thought-provoking and very stimulating presentation. I'll have one conclusion where I will agree with Tim, but before coming to that conclusion, let me begin by saying that from where I am located, it seems to me that childhood is becoming an increasingly risky proposition. I'm saying this by looking at the work which we as Save the Children and many other similar international child rights and child development agencies are doing and have been doing over the last many years. It seems to me that there are 5 main reasons why childhood is a risky proposition, and I'm going to touch on them very briefly in turn. The first issue is that of globalization. We live in a world which is increasingly consumer-driven, where the search for new markets is something that is driving economies across the world. Globalization can bring many benefits, but the flip side of globalization is that it requires enormous amounts of cheap and easily available labor. This in turn fuels the demand for child labor, and in the arena in which I work, child labor is one of the biggest forms of exploitation of children that we have today. If you look at recent reports prepared by the International Labour Organization, you will find that the figure for child labor today is in the region of 250 million across the world. That's a very large number, and out of those, there are several million who are considered to be in what is called unconditional worst forms of child labor. Children who work in areas such as prostitution, in hazardous activities, who are exploited and trafficked, and these are areas where we are extremely concerned as a result of the growing demand for child labor, which is fueling this. The second main concern, and why I believe childhood is becoming increasingly risky, is the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Across vast tracts of Southern Africa, South Asia, we are confronted with a particular problem, which is child-headed families, children who have lost both parents and who are left to survive in very hostile conditions where there are no safety nets, where they are vulnerable to all kinds of exploitation from the society around them. We need to take the risk of HIV/AIDS very seriously, and we need to invest in preventative and treatment programs. The third main concern from where I sit, and why I say childhood is a risky business, is the development and growth of new information technologies. The fact is that the internet provides both opportunities and challenges, but it also creates great risks. And we're all aware of the problems around child pornography, around issues where new information technology is being used in order to not only exploit children, but to abuse them. The fourth area that I'm very concerned about is that of conflict. There are many wars that are happening, some of which obviously gain the headlines, but many are what we call low-intensity conflicts. And these conflicts tend to affect children in two ways: by making them victims, but also by making them participants. I'm thinking particularly of child soldiers, and child soldiers in situations like the one we have in northern Uganda, where children are kidnapped, forced into the child militias, and made to fight. Girls are particularly vulnerable because they're taken as child sex slaves within those contexts. The last point is climate change. We've heard a lot about the panel of experts who've provided us enormous amounts of information about what's happening with the climate. But there's one particular aspect which is very worrying from a development point of view and its impact for children. Climate change causes all kinds of climatic problems, obviously: floods, droughts, and scarce resources which force families apart and force children into extremely vulnerable situations. At the moment, we are running a campaign to help children in Southern Africa and Mozambique who've been affected by floods, and it's precisely these sorts of situations which we will see increasingly as the world's climate changes. Those, for me, are the 5 key areas where I believe childhood has resulted in increasingly increased risks for children in childhood. I wouldn't want to leave you with a picture of doom and gloom at the end of this. So let me just very briefly, with the permission of the chair, touch on 4 particular solutions, which I will only mention. The first, and this is where I said I will completely agree with Tim, is we need, and this is increasingly evident in our work, in all our work across all these areas, to trust, to listen to, and to involve children. They are the greatest source of wisdom. They have the most sensible solutions to a lot of these problems. And child participation and the involvement of children in our activities, in our governance issues, in the way in which we undertake our development work, is increasingly at the heart of what we do. And it is extremely important that we trust children and we involve them in our work. The other 3 solutions, the first is to address root causes. And the root causes are issues of hunger, health, education. There's no getting away from this, and we need to invest in these areas, and we need to ensure that children benefit from these investments. The third solution is to hold governments accountable. There are too many governments who get away with policies which are not child-friendly. There is a fine balance, and I agree, between becoming a nanny state and having a completely hands-off approach. We need to find that balance, but there are too many governments who are not being held accountable for the abuse and exploitation of their children. And the last, and the thought I would leave you with, is that citizens of the world can make a big contribution to change. We are finding increasingly citizens' action is one of the most important and effective ways in which we can promote change for children's lives across the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, that's an enormous amount of very rich and stimulating veins to pursue. Are children irredeemably vulnerable, and is it our job to protect them, or is there a disease of risk aversion spread by those fantastic twin goblins, elf and safety? Are we just covering our backs? Are we confused about what being a child is all about? Are we losing normal human contact? Do we need better education on accidents in children? And is childhood increasingly a risky proposition? So all of those things, I'm sure many of you have much to say about. Thank you. Just behind you, I think this.
What I would like to ask all panelists is that, given that one of the primary reasons for the decline in children's autonomy is parental fears of stranger danger, whether they would share the view I feel strongly, which is that children should be encouraged to talk to strangers.
The mother of my child is in the audience. So without having had a conflab about it, I think my initial thought is I'd want to try and foster my daughter's ability to make that judgment for herself. So I think it would be unhelpful to give her the message that, you know, she should go out and chat to anyone who's around. I also think it's desperately unhelpful to give her the message that she shouldn't chat to any adults she doesn't know. And she has had that message from school, but frankly, she ignores it, and we're quite comfortable about that.
So the two ladies here, thank you.
In the light of new government guidance for encouraging teachers to give pupils as many extracurricular experiences as possible, how did the panel overcome the reluctance of many practitioners to leave the classroom, given the amount of paperwork involved and the need for fully CRB-cleared helpers? For example, if I may clarify, I must fully risk assess taking 8 children to another school in a nearby village. I must ensure they only come into contact with the CRB designated helpers. I cannot take them in my own car or have any discussion with the parents about who may be able to give lifts to those children. Any thoughts?
Thank you. Pass it along, thank you.
Very similar sort of statement and question. For the last 10 years, I'm a keen sailor, and I'm, in the past, been able to take 18 children sailing, which children in East London don't get the privilege of doing. This year, with the new law about booster seats, I've joked with parents and said, I'm afraid, unless he's tall, he can't come. I can now only take 3 with booster seats, not 4. This increases the convoy. At this moment in time, in my last year of service, do I put myself at this risk of taking children who have had such a wonderful experience?
Yes, I wish I had an answer, because my immediate thought, particularly the first teacher who asked the question, is you've got your work cut out. In a way, I think it's reached a point where as the new system unfolds, it will become so transparently obvious that it's unworkable that there will have to be a revisiting. It seems to me that there is sufficient concern now, quite widely across risk management, for, in the long term, there to be some prospect that we can literally roll back the paperwork and the bureaucratic safety systems. But in the meantime, you've got your work cut out.
Now, thank you very, very much for all your comments and contributions, and go home safely. There's a lot of dangers out there.